Hi, welcome to Storytime on the Back Porch. I'm Lisa with my furry friends. This is Lilly Belle, and this is Lyla. Have you ever been afraid to do something for the very first time? Well, in our story today, Kayla is afraid of the first day of kindergarten, but she has a special teacher that takes that fear away. This is called Teaching Mrs. Muddle by Colleen Nelson, and the pictures are drawn by Alice Carter. Let's find out about this special Mrs. Muddle.
What if I get lost? I whispered to Mom. It was the first day of kindergarten. What if I couldn't find the bathroom or missed her so much I started to cry? The teacher said, "Welcome, kindergartners. I'm Mrs. Muddle." I held Mom's hand even tighter. Mrs. Muddle handed out name tags. Mom looked down at mine and laughed. "Oh, you made a mistake. This is Kayla, not Jeremy." It took a while to sort out the name tags. Then Mrs. Muddle opened the front doors, and we followed her down the hall to the classroom. Mrs. Muddle told us it was time to say goodbye to our parents. "Don't worry," she whispered. "They'll be okay without you." Mom didn't look ready to say goodbye. I didn't know what she'd do without me all day. Inside the classroom, Mrs. Muddle was reading my favorite book, the one I knew by heart. She was making all kinds of mistakes. I gave Mom my best brave face and went to help Mrs. Muddle read the book properly. "Time for a tour of the school," said Mrs. Muddle. "First stop is where you get to run and skip and throw balls." I knew which room that was. I loved running and skipping and throwing. We stood in a line and went to the... "Look, kids," said Mrs. Muddle. "Mrs. Zing made a bookshelf obstacle course." I looked at all the books.
"Isn't this the library?"
I asked.
"The gym is where you get to run."
Mrs. Muddle snapped her fingers. "Right. Thank you, Kayla. We'll go there after the music room." That sounded good to me. I liked singing almost as much as I liked running. Mrs. Muddle opened the door. There weren't any instruments, just kids sitting at desk. Someone was tapping a pencil. "Let's clap the beat," she said.
"Mrs. Muddle,"
I whispered.
"this isn't the music room. That's my neighbor. He's in 5th grade."
Mrs. Muddle backed out slowly and apologized to the teacher. "One room I can't mix up is the bathroom," Mrs. Muddle declared. But it turned out she could. She stopped 3 times to ask people for directions. When we finally found it, it wasn't the bathroom at all.
"Mrs. Muddle, maybe you should let me handle this,"
I said. "But it's your first day. You might get lost." Even on my first day, I didn't think I'd get more lost than Mrs. Muddle. Getting around the school wasn't as tricky as I'd thought. The teachers we passed said hello and pointed me in the right direction. Some rooms were easy to find, like the office and the real gym. "Look, kids, it's the phys ed teacher, Mr. Blue," said Mrs. Muddle. "You mean Mr. Brown," he said, and gave us high fives. Before we could play tag, we had to learn the gym rules. Everyone followed them, except for Mrs. Muddle. We stopped our game to help her clean up. "Thanks, Mr. Black," she said. "Where to next, Kayla?" I was about to look for the real music room when a bell rang. Kids stampeded out of the classrooms and filled up the hallway. "What's going on?" Mrs. Muddle asked. The big kids went out the doors carrying balls and skipping ropes. That's when I figured out. It's recess! By the time we put on our outdoor shoes, the big kids were coming back inside. We had the whole playground to ourselves. I showed Mrs. Muddle how to swing and use a slide the right way. Everyone was having fun until Jeremy fell. "I'm bleeding," he cried. "Stay calm," Mrs. Muddle said. "Psst, What do we do? She whispered to me. Luckily, I knew. I'd spied a jar of bandages in the office. Phew! Who's ready for snack time? Mrs. Muddle asked when we got back to the classroom. She made another mistake and gave us pudding at the Arts Center. We practiced our letters and ate our snack at the same time. Before I knew it, the bell rang for the end of the day. How was your first day? Mom asked.
Great,
I said. I'd been so busy making new friends and showing Mrs. Muddle around the school, I hadn't missed Mom at all. I just had one question.
Mom, are you sure Mrs. Muddle is ready to teach kindergarten?
Mom smiled. Oh, I think she knows just what she's doing.
Okay, Mrs. Muddle made me giggle. I mean, she was reading storybooks upside down. What a great story. Teaching Mrs. Muddle. So glad you could join us today for Storytime on the Back Porch. Be sure and subscribe so you can listen to a story read aloud anytime.